Good evening. Welcome to today's panel conversation on race, voice, and representation in American politics. For those of you who are new to this series, my name is Michael Deli Carpini. I'm a faculty member and former dean of the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania, and I'm faculty director of the SNF Padilla program at Penn, whose mission is to facilitate robust, informed, and respectful dialogue on the many difficult, contentious issues facing the nation and the globe, and across the many ideological, cultural, and demographic divides that too often keep us from effectively addressing these issues. This panel is the 12th of 13 we are holding over the course of this academic year as part of the preceptorial on racism and anti-racism in contemporary America. The preceptorial is designed for Penn undergrads, but each panel is open to the entire Penn community and to the larger public. Today's panel conversation is sponsored by the SNF Padilla program at Penn and co-sponsored by the Office of the Vice President for Social Equity and Community, the Office of the Provost, the Andrea Mitchell Center, Civic House, and New Student Orientation and Academic Initiatives, all as part of the Year of Civic Engagement at Penn. Now, while inspired by events such as the murder of George Floyd and the resulting protests, demonstrations, and the calls for change that emerged from them, this series of panel discussions is designed to explore the ways in which racism has long been embedded in our country's economic, housing, public health, criminal justice, education, cultural, media, and political systems, to better understand the root causes of this structural racism and to identify what we have or might do to address these inequalities. I should note now that the audience that you can use the Q&A function on your screens to ask questions. While we won't be able to answer all of them directly, we will leave some time towards the end of today's panel for me to ask our panelists some of them on your behalf. Now, before I introduce the panelists we have, I should note that unfortunately, Adolph Reed, who was supposed to be on the panel, is under the weather a bit, and so won't be able to join us tonight. We hope he's feeling better soon. But we have another stellar panel to address today's issue and your questions. I'll now very briefly introduce them. So I'll ask the panelists now if they would unmute their videos so the audience can see you as I do introductions. Great, thank you. So first is Traci Burch, Associate Professor of Political Science at Northwestern University. Professor Burch is the author of Trading Democracy for Justice, published by the University of Chicago Press, and is co-author of Creating a New Racial Order, published by Princeton University Press. Her work has appeared in numerous peer-reviewed journals, including Political Behavior, Law and Society Review, and Criminology and Public Policy. Professor Burch also serves as a research professor at the American Bar Foundation. She has received a number of prestigious awards for her research, including the American Political Science Association Ralph Bunche Book Award, the APSA Urban Politics Section Best Book Award, and the APSA Law and Courts Section C. Herman Pritchett Award, all for Trading Democracy for Justice. Welcome, Traci. Our second panelist is Vincent Hutchings, the Diversity and Social Transformation Professor and the Haynes Walton Jr. Collegiate Professor of Political Science and Afroamerican and African Studies at the University of Michigan. Professor Hutchings' research interests include public opinion, elections, voting behavior, and African-American politics. Among his many publications are the books Public Opinion and Democratic Accountability, How Citizens Learn About Politics, and African Americans in the American Political System. Professor Hutchings was a Robert Wood Johnson Health Policy Scholar and has received multiple grants from the National Science Foundation, including for his project entitled Elite Communication and Racial Group Conflict in the 21st Century. Welcome, Vince. Our third panelist is Michael Jones-Correa, the President's Distinguished Professor of Political Science and Director of the Center for the Study of Ethnicity, Race, and Immigration at the University of Pennsylvania. Professor Jones-Correa is author or co-author of Holding Fast, Resilience and Civic Engagement Among Latino Immigrants, of Latinos in the New Millennium, and Latino Lives in America, Making It Home. He's also author of Between Two Nations, The Political Predicament of Latinos in New York City. And he is editor of Governing American Cities, Interethnic Coalitions, Competition and Conflict, and co-editor of Outsiders No More, Models of Immigrant Political Incorporation. His research has received support from the Carnegie, Ford, MacArthur, Robert Wood Johnson, Russell Sage, and National Science Foundations, among others. Thank you for being here, Michael. Our last panelist is Nicholas Valentino, professor of political science at the University of Michigan. Professor Valentino's fields of study include American government and politics, political psychology, and race, ethnicity, and politics. He's author of numerous journal articles and book chapters, including Fear, Anger, and Voting for the Far Right, Evidence from the November 13th, 2015 Paris terror attacks, of ethnocentrism versus group-specific stereotyping and immigration opinion, cross-national evidence on the distinctiveness of Muslim immigrants, and the changing norms of racial political rhetoric and the end of racial priming. Professor Valentino's scholarship has been recognized with a number of awards from the Midwest Political Science Association, the American Political Science Association, and the International Society for Political Psychology. Thanks for being here, Nick, and thanks to all of you for being here tonight. So let's get started. And before we get started on the particular and complex topic, as we discussed earlier, of the role of the political system in addressing issues of race and racism in the United States, I wanted to give you all a chance to reflect in general on any recent events that have taken place or what you're thinking about as we go through this intense period that we're in. For example, the tragic killings of 6 Asian American women in Atlanta, Georgia, the police killings of Dante Wright in Brooklyn Center, Minnesota, and of Adam Toledo in Chicago, and most obviously and recently, yesterday's verdict in the Derek Chauvin trial regarding the killing of George Floyd, or really any other event or topic with implications for the issues of racial justice that you've been thinking about, that's on your mind right now. And so no particular order. If you don't mind, Traci, I'll start with you. Anything that you're thinking about as we all have been thinking about these issues over the last year and longer, obviously, but intensely over the last year. Any thoughts that you might have, points you want to make?
I am like most people in the sense that I'm disturbed by everything I'm seeing in the news, especially all of the violence. And this is completely off topic, but I guess for me, like in the wake of all of this, last Thursday night, my nephew got shot and was paralyzed from the waist down. And I'm so dealing with that as a family, dealing with everything else that's happening has just been really difficult and emotionally draining. And so it's like, I don't know if I have any thoughts about anything to share other than the fact that it's just, I'm drained. I think we're all drained, and it's hard to keep fighting in the wake of just so much tragedy. But yesterday's trial at least showed that sometimes, fighting matters and you win. And I think even I don't even know if I would call yesterday a victory. No one won yesterday. But I think that times like those, when you can at least breathe a sigh of relief, are helpful in keeping the fight going.
Thank you for that. And I just feel, I'm so sorry to hear about how this has come home to hit you personally. Our thoughts, I'm sure all our thoughts are with your nephews. Really, really sorry to hear that.
Thank you.
Vince, any general feelings about where we are right now?
Yeah, it's in some respects, I think I feel similar to Traci. It's I guess I'm of two minds, Michael, in that over this last year, of course, with the demonstrations that unfolded in the wake of the now we can say murder of George Floyd, I've actually felt an uncharacteristic level of optimism, uncharacteristic in terms of the study and contemplation of questions of race. The widespread sense of outrage is really it's kind of invigorating in some regards, and so I think that there is something positive about that, if only in the recognition of the magnitude and the depth of this problem. So that's the positive part. And the second part, very much similar to what Traci said, is as someone who has studied these issues for about 30 years now, I don't know if I'm feeling battle fatigue or if this is also just a consequence of the sheltering in place. But I am a little exhausted, even with the guarded good news, as Traci said about the verdict yesterday. It is still very quite depressing and deflating, all of this. So
Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
that's not. I don't feel like you should feel strange or odd about that. I mean, I see that all around me right now, and it's one of the things that is understandable and worrisome at the same time because of the first part of what you said, Vince, which is that the hopefulness that came out of some of what's been going on over the last year. But totally understand that. Michael.
So I was thinking we'd be having a very different conversation. The tone would be very different if the outcome yesterday had gone the other way. You know, that I don't feel a sense of optimism about this, but well, it's the times when the state polices itself are so rare. You know, in some sense, as Traci was saying, and it doesn't really feel like a victory. It feels like this is what should be happening as a bare minimum, and that it happens only when these actions become visible, when they're recorded by happenstance, by a bystander. It's only when these actions are visible that they're even capable of being adjudicated through the court system. And there's so many times when the actions are invisible. What people encounter in the day-to-day are not recorded, are not made visible, and they're simply taken as part of the price of being seen as different, your body being seen as not one of us. And you mentioned at the start, you know, this can take lots of different forms in this country, whether race or gender or religion, and just being marked as different. And the price of difference is born in again in the day-to-day, and not often sort of made starkly visible in the way it was with George Floyd.
Yep. I agree. I don't know how much that I could add to that. Nick, what would you like to add in the way you're feeling about these issues right now?
I'll just quickly build a little bit on what Mike, something that, well, all of my colleagues have said, which is that I was feeling yesterday, it was very difficult for me to work, and I was feeling very emotionally exhausted and anxious, waiting for the verdict. And then when the verdict was announced, I thought I might feel relieved at that outcome, but I just felt very sad that our country and so many of us who pay attention to these things was so uncertain about a case that seemed like the evidence was incontrovertible because of the acts of a young woman, a 17-year-old girl who had the courage to stand there and video the killing of a person over a $20 bill. And the fact that we live in a country where we had to just worry so much about this outcome in this particular case. And then, of course, it hit me, as it hit many of us, and you, I'm sure too, Michael, that during that trial, three other kids got shot by police. 3 other children of color or young people of color got shot by police. And now, yesterday, another what seems like it's at least possible could have been avoided, another death. Just like Traci said, so much violence, and so much violence that can't be justified in my view. in order to keep us safe. This is not how we keep a country safe.
Well, again, I feel and understand the mixed emotions, but also the sense of fatigue. Worrisome as I mentioned earlier, it is. I'm really glad you mentioned the young woman who videotaped it, though, Nick, because for me, one of the areas I can look at and feel more positive about was what was called the crowd that gathered. I don't even know if that's the right word to use for it. Where I thought the most impressive part of what happened. They played their roles as citizens. They felt the frustration that you're all talking about, but they did their civic duty, and that's another reason why we were able to get, even in this fairly, reasonably obvious case, why there was these convictions was because of the role that they played and that they fulfilled in this. So I want to talk to some of these issues of kind of how we are kind of collectively feeling, because I think it's crucial to where we go from here. But before we do that, I'd like to now turn to the specific topic of today's panel, which is what role have the institutions and processes of American politics played in addressing issues of racial injustice, but also in maintaining and even exacerbating these injustices. Over the long arc of this issue in the United States, do we have a sense, at least in the current moment, that it's changing? And if so, how and where, for better or worse? I mean, the idea here, these are broad issues. We talked about that before we came online here. But the idea is to give an audience a sense of how the political system, thinking about the national system, but also state and local, through the policies it passes, through the electoral process, is implicated, for better or worse, in the current state of racial inequity in the U.S. And just give us some thoughts, some examples, some hopeful and maybe not so hopeful things to point to about in this 400-year experience that we've had, and in this moment we have, which at times has felt like an inflection point. What is government's role in all of this, for better or for worse? And that's broad. I know you can take that whatever direction you want, but Vince, do you have thoughts on where there are a lot of political scientists on this panel? What is government's role? What have they done? What can we point to and said this is what they need to do more of or less of?
Yeah, it's the right question, Michael, and it's a good question. I mentioned before we went live here that I have been thinking. I mentioned to the other panelists that I have been thinking about this for a while, and I didn't have a good answer, and I still don't really, frankly, have a good answer. Indeed, if one thing and I'm not going to take long, and I will get around to being more responsive, but I'll just say quickly that this last year in particular, in part because of what's going on in the streets and in the courts and in the halls of Congress, but also just in terms of my teaching and such, is that I've become more and more aware of just how much I don't know. So Michael gave me a very, along with the other panelists, a nice introduction, and all of us have very fine accolades and awards and such, but this is a pretty big problem, and I am more and more familiar with my inability to have a good handle on how to resolve it. So that's just kind of my opening statement in this regard. I'll say, in terms of how the institutions, to be more responsive, how the institutions of government writ large may be implicated in or may be able to affect some kind of change. I don't know if I'm equipped to give that kind of answer. I see my role as an academic is mostly in being able to diagnose the problem and not so much being able to offer appropriate remedies. But diagnosis is an important part of the healing process. So I think what I do is important, even though I am not confident at all that I'm able to provide any answers. Having said that, then, if there's one institution that I would draw our attention to, not necessarily because I think it's the most important, but just because it's the one where I do most of my own work, it would be in the American party system. When we often think about institutions, we think appropriately of the media or the legislative, judicial, or executive branches, et cetera. And that's appropriate that we think that, but we often find ourselves wondering, I find, in the aftermath of an election, how it is that we are so divided, and oh, what can we do to bring ourselves together as a country, as if we were ever together as a country. And in answer to that kind of familiar lament, I would say that there's something endemic to the way American politics plays out in the United States. When I say our party system, we've obviously got two major parties in this country and a variety of minor parties, but the game is mostly about Democrats versus Republicans. And the extent to which individuals are wedded to those parties breaks down very sharply along racial and ethnic lines in this country. So even before a candidate emerges, whether that candidate's name is Joe Biden or Donald Trump or something else, there is already a racial division. That's what I mean when I say that it's kind of baked into the system. So it's easy to identify the boogeyman at the moment, Dick Cheney, depending on your politics, Donald Trump, Joe Biden, Barack Obama, George W. Bush. But the truth is that those figures come and they go. And but what remains constant in the American political system is, of course, the party division, at least since the 1800s, the mid 1800s, and that has always, since that time, broken down along racial lines. So I don't pretend to know what the solution is to that problem, but the problem isn't about a candidate, whether his name or her name is Trump or Clinton or Obama or anything else. So that would be, I guess, my opening comment.
Yeah, that's helpful. And I want to return to the role of party in all of this. But Michael, thoughts that you might have?
I'm dreading having the question turned to me. I think I have some of the same kind of immediate response, which is they're huge questions and then feel inadequate to the task of answering them. I will say that the state government has been sort of implicated in the structuring of unequal treatment of people by race and other dimensions in this country from the very beginning. So it's complicit, the state is complicit in how people have been treated unequally, continues to be complicit. And at the same time, the state plays a role in trying to remedy some of these inequalities. So, what I've been thinking about more recently, and I was thinking a bit as sort of gathering my thoughts for this panel, is that there's going to be a lot of attention on, and the aftermath of the Chauvin trial, and as Congress prepares to address it, there's going to be a lot of attention on policing. And I think policing is an important part of the state's presence in society and in the way that the state sort of, again, marks people's bodies for differential treatment. But I worry a bit that we're going to focus only on policing and the way what policing is again, marking unequal treatment in the way that people inhabit space and public space. But so much of the inequality goes much beyond that. And you mentioned at your opening remarks, questions about housing and education. We live in very segregated spaces, very segregated cities. Philadelphia is a very segregated city where the structuring of space, the way people live in neighborhoods, is highly unequal, and that has consequences. It has consequences for people's life outcomes in terms of education, in terms of health, and we're not going to be paying attention to this if all we're paying attention to is policing.
Yeah. I completely agree with that. It's been one of the reasons, this series has been structured, if I could just take a moment, to cover different aspects of structural racism, and it's broken down to the systems you would expect: economic inequality, issues of housing, issues of public health, issues of the criminal justice system. But what is both, I think, useful about that, but also troubling with that approach, is that they are all so interconnected that it does begin to feel deeply overwhelming as to how to deal with these issues, because there doesn't seem to be an obvious entry point. I was hoping that it might be the political system, but I can see that that there's no confidence at that level at this point either. Nick.
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, it is overwhelming. I was just thinking about these layers, these institutional layers that produce and reproduce discriminatory treatment, and then unfair outcomes over generations. And that's work that Vince has been doing, and Michael, and then of course with the criminal justice system work that Traci and others have been doing, which I'm a consumer of and have learned a lot from. You know, the political system itself, in addition to the party system that Vince was talking about, there are so many institutions that we need to worry about. So just in that domain, for example, the dozens and dozens of laws that are now being proposed in state legislatures around the country that are going to, in one way or another, restrict people's easier access to the ballot, even though those laws themselves are not popular even among Republicans. And once easier access to the ballot, and by the way, they've been proposed to solve a problem that no one can demonstrate exists, which is voter fraud, which no one has been able to demonstrate exists, either in courts of law or in any other location. So we're proposing dozens and dozens of laws to make it harder to vote. And those laws, many of those laws will, in fact, in some cases, have the explicit intention of handicapping people of color and Democratic people who identify with the Democratic Party. How do they do that? Well, you can, if you know that African Americans organize voting efforts in the church on Sundays, and they have help parishioners go to the polls and to understand the voting system, then you can make it harder for people to do that on Sundays, which some of these laws are trying to do. For example, there are many examples of this, but I do want to say, since you asked about what things sound terrible and unequal, and then is there another side of this, and that is that parties can't do this without being noticed, and that's because people like Stacey Abrams and other people can mobilize around this unfairness, this inequality, these institutions that produce and reproduce inequality. Those things have to eventually come to light. They can't be done completely in secret. Even gerrymandering, where African American votes are packed into very homogeneous districts, and then white votes are spread out more evenly in larger numbers of districts, so that you can get you can start to multiply the electoral impact of white votes over African American votes. That eventually is going to come to light. And in fact, it has over the last several years started to come to light. And I think that's the beauty of our system, is that we have the right to speak out about this sort of thing. And activists have the right to speak out. And there are people in every racial background and in every party background who recognize that unfairness and say, no, enough is enough. We can't do that anymore. And so the encouraging part is the protest movements that occurred over the last summer, despite the fact that we were in a pandemic, those were multiracial, highly diverse protest movements. And they were acting on specific information about unfairness in our institutions, including policing, but not only policing. And I was encouraged by that. And I think that, if that can continue, we can make a positive difference.
That's great. Thank you for bringing that up, Vince. And again, another topic I'd like to return to. But before we do, Traci, your thoughts on what can you point to in terms of the role of the federal or state and local government in terms of being part of the ways in which we address these issues, and what can you point to that have point to the government as basically helping to enforce the racial inequities we have?
So my perspective on this is very different because I have been an expert witness in a bunch of voting rights cases where I actually make arguments about this and can talk about, what these problems are and what I would like to happen to fix them. And I think that from that perspective, it's been really frustrating because what we've been seeing recently in terms of all of these changes that we've been proposing to election laws to make voting harder, it's not new. It's been going on for years. And things like changing registration deadlines, making absentee voting harder, making it harder for people with felony convictions to vote, purging voters, requiring photo ID to register, shortening early voting. That's been happening in states across the US. It's been happening for years. It predates Shelby County versus Holder in 2013. And these laws, they work to disadvantage Black people and other people because structurally, the Democratic Party has been ignoring it and dismissing it and subsuming it as identity politics until after 2016 when they realized it was in their interest to care. And the Supreme Court and a bunch of lower courts pretend that facially neutral election laws don't discriminate and they only look for evidence of intentional racism. And so, so it basically is you have these laws come out and you have like advocates and nonpartisan groups go in and challenge that these laws have disparate impact on racial minorities and disabled people and bring out lots of evidence and to no avail. And the reason the disparate impact happens is because inequalities in other domains translate into political inequality because of the things that Michael and Nick were talking about. In the sense, racial residential segregation makes it really easy to deprive people of color of equal access to polling places. Poverty can lead to inequalities in residential mobility, which can lead people to have a harder time staying registered to vote because they could get purged more easily. Poverty, age, and disability can lead to disparities in having a photo ID, which makes it harder to access the ballot. 36 states require or ask for photo ID for voting. Criminal justice interactions and inequality vary by race, and those lead to bans on voting, both for people who are serving sentences, but also for people who have legal debt they can't pay. So, even disabilities and health conditions like diabetes and heart conditions can make it easier to access polling places and make polling places dangerous during a pandemic. But, so there's all these ways that other forms of inequality are allowed to translate into political inequality that I think can explain this. But it's not just disparate impact. It's also like laws are still applied unequally. So Black voters face purging campaigns more often. Voter caging, which is like sending registered mail to Black households in Black neighborhoods. And then when that mail isn't returned, then either political operatives or people in the Secretary of State's office then can challenge those registrations or mark them for purging, either before the polls or they can get challenged at the polls. Harassment, intimidation, challenges from poll watchers. They face that's just something that happens on purpose. And there's also lots of evidence that this disparate impact of election laws is like it's a feature and not a bug in the system. And so, because states fight all the time against reasonable changes and accommodations that would make voting easier, like curbside voting or for people with disabilities. So it just is one of those things where, and some of the states are open about this. Like one of the cases I was in, the judge wrote in the opinion, the defendant's argument is essentially that the individual plaintiffs have not shown enough creativity and initiative to get their absentee ballots witnessed or notarized. And this Alabama Secretary of State wrote in a newspaper in response to someone, a newspaper columnist who said that they didn't vote because they were scared about COVID, that person was either lazy or did not care enough to vote. And so it's not as if this is a new problem. We don't know that there are some specific ways to fix it. It's just that there's a lot of multiple veto points in the system at the local, federal, and state levels that prevent those solutions from happening.
Yeah, thank you for pointing those very specific details out, because that, it's interesting because all four of you, Traci, not so much you in this last question, but in your earlier question, started off by saying, I don't really know how to answer these questions and what's going on. And yet I'm sitting here listing the points that you've raised. The role that redistricting plays, the role that party plays, and the racial divide that defines parties. The way in voters' laws, both, is used as a, I would argue from what you said, Traci, I don't want to put words in your mouth, that is used as a tool of at least a political party, if not the state, to repress voting. That is a use of the government to produce a certain kind of result. No one mentioned the filibuster, but certainly there's a very specific rule that in a hyper-partisan environment that is relatively equally split, and only equally split because of a redistricting process that gives outweighed weight to, and a Senate system that gives outweighed power to large but still minority segments of the population. The court system and how the courts have been used in both sides of this issue. I mean, that's the kind of thing that you have brought to the table because of the work that you do as political scientists. And I think all of those, it's complicated, obviously, but they're all in play. So let me, to get to the issue of, so why is it working this way? Let me ask a few more specific questions than I had intended to. So, I'm an old political scientist, and I can remember when political science theory said that in a two-party system, when one party, its views tend to be too far afield of its public, that it would move to the middle. And I think since the election of Barack Obama in 2008, at least some political scientists I know have been kind of waiting for the moment when the Republican Party would moderate its views, because it appeared to be the case that the views of the party leadership, and public opinion polling shows this, was out of line with the views of at least where the middle ground is in American politics. And not only did that not happen, but the strategy of staying extreme turns out to have been effective in a number of elections. Now, is that because we've become so hyper polarized that we've become, in the words of some political scientists, we've become, or statisticians, we've become bimodal in the way we're distributed on issues? Because that doesn't appear to be the case on a lot of issues that really matter, like voting rights, like gun control, or what we're witnessing the ability of the leadership of one party to kind of cling to power when they, by using the tools of democracy in an undemocratic way. I mean, is this a public opinion and public issue, or is this a leadership within one particular party issue? Just kind of like as one of the issues that you raised as one of the causes of this, the fact that there is that race and party have become kind of correlated with each other, if you will. To what extent is that? Is it because of leadership, or to what extent is it because that party actually is representing a substantial percentage of the American public? I don't know. Vince, I think you brought party up, so why don't you just start us off on this? I mean, talk a little bit to me about what role, in more detail, as to what it means to say that this party divide is part of what's driving all of this.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I really appreciate the comments from my fellow panelists as well. It's in answer to your question, Michael, I think it's that it's true that there isn't a lot of polarization when it comes to specific issues. I think Nick made a reference to this as well. So, for example, the American Rescue Plan Act is pretty popular, even among many, admittedly a minority, but still a pretty big minority of Republicans. So it's not necessarily policy per se, it's groups. And it is, roughly 80 to 85% of Blacks are aligned with the Democratic Party and have been for at least 55 years.
Yeah.
And roughly 2/3 of Latinos and increasingly at least that many Asian Americans are also those who at least vote, are also aligned with the Democratic Party. And of course, roughly 55% of whites are aligned with the Republicans. So we've got a country, everyone knows over the last several months about how much racial division we have in this country, and indeed how much partisan and political division we have. But they don't always appreciate that those things are kind of reinforcing one another. And so some of the comments that Traci was making a moment ago are very much motivated by the fact that you can identify demographically who your partisan opponents are based on, as Michael also said previously, the segregated parts of the country or county or city where they live. You know what their demographics are, you know their ethnicity and their race, and therefore you know their partisanship because those are so closely aligned. And so Republicans, as Nick was arguing, are pushing some of these efforts to address the phantom voter fraud issue precisely because they know it will affect people of color who don't vote for them. So it's irrational on some level, actually, in that that's how they're behaving, and it's a consequence of their desire to acquire, achieve, or hold on to political power.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I mean, I think that helps clarify that issue, and I like the way you tied it to both what Michael had to say and what Traci had to say. Again, I'll say, the issue of the way parties operate now is put on the table by you all. The issue of redistricting, the voter laws issue is really important. Traci commented on the fact that this is not new. Certainly is not new. It feels more out in the open, to go to one of the points Nick was making. And it feels as if there are more people in the general public who realize the importance of voting laws. And it feels like there are more people in the population who feel like, who will explicitly say, well, we think, it should be relatively easy for people to vote. And yet we still fail on that front. And then you also were talking about other aspects of the system, like issues of gerrymandering more specifically. So let me just turn to you, Michael. You've been doing this a long time as well. Are there aspects of what we thought we knew as political scientists that are now being challenged, or is it that we're seeing what we thought was true just play out in a more complicated and public way than it was before? It feels to me like we should have something to say about what kind of activity would likely lead to more positive change. Any additional thoughts that you have on what that might look like, or where other root causes like the issue of party that Vince pointed to that you can point to?
Yeah, I think I'd like to return to a point you raised earlier, which is this puzzle, which should be puzzling to political scientists. If you have a two-party system, why isn't there convergence at the center? And that, at least at the moment, we don't seem to be seeing that convergence. We've seen sort of persistent polarization, and if you look at, say, distribution in Congress, the parties seem to be moving in opposite directions, so becoming more distant from one another in the positions that they take. So I think this is a kind of an interesting question to raise. But my own view on this is to point to party primaries as one place where so it creates a set of incentives as candidates are positioning themselves in their party primaries to take more say, more radical positions, particularly among Republicans. And you would think then that in a general election, they would moderate and move back to the center. But I think that certainly from the, say, early 2000s, I look at the, say, 2004 election as one example where the Republican Party made a calculated decision that it didn't need to move to the center, that it could win by mobilizing its own voters. The number of states that passed laws or positions on gay marriage, for instance, during that election cycle, as a way to mobilize their partisans. And I think at least the Republican Party has decided that this is their strategy, to win by mobilizing their partisans and by demobilizing the opposition. And so many of the voting laws that we've been talking about are essentially attempts to demobilize the opposition. And this is not healthy for democracy. So, but it does also point to some very clear policy solutions. I mean, I think ways to address these kinds of issues are certainly we can imagine what they would look like. Implementing those changes is another question.
I agree. I also agree with whoever said it earlier that as political scientists, that's not our role necessarily, but to speak to the issues. Traci, you, I really was taken by the point you were making about the court cases that you were involved in, and the dilemma that Vince raised about the correlation between demographics and party, that makes it easier to do this kind of gerrymandering. What's the state of the court decisions on whether party could be building districts around party? My vague recollection, that's not an area that I study, was that is the one area that the Supreme Court and courts have said, no, you can't gerrymander based on race and on other kinds of discriminatory actions. But when it comes to party, that's up to the states to do. Do I have that right? Is that still the case? And what role does that play?
Yeah, and interestingly enough, there was a Supreme Court case. I think it was, there have been lots of them since, but there was actually one in which partisan gerrymandering, they said, was basically fine. And a lot of political scientists actually presented amicus briefs to the court with information about this is like, you could write computer programs to not partisan. To not. And the courts were just like, this is mumbo jumbo with these programs. We're just not gonna do this, and it's fine. So the general idea is that it's not there aren't many limits on partisan gerrymandering at all. At least but that doesn't mean it's not possible. You could still have a legislative limit on it. It's just that courts aren't going to oppose it.
Yeah, and just so the audience members know what we're talking about, since it's a little bit inside baseball, the courts can look at the way in which congressional districts have been drawn, and if a case can be made that they were drawn in a way that was meant to disenfranchise certain voters. I mean, I'm oversimplifying it. It's not my area. The states could be told that they need to redraw those districts, but and the idea is that districts have to be about the same size, which leads to the redrawing of districts. But the courts have in general said that redrawing districts based on the partisan makeup of the people in the district, that's not something that would necessarily be limited. Yeah, Traci.
And a two-finger on that. Some states do limit partisan gerrymandering.
And so that's a state level decision that can still be made. That's great. Thank you for that. Nick, I know your focus tends to be more on kind of what goes on, as you've said earlier, before we got to went live, what goes on in people's heads. I find myself increasingly thinking that, thinking about the way people make a decision as to who to vote for, the way partisanship has become more effective and tribal in what it means to people. How much of this is political, but not necessarily systemically political, but political in the sense of trying to better, if we're going to address this, we have to better understand what motivates people for the ways in which they make their decisions, their attitudes even about issues of race and so on, and how important it is.
Yeah, Vince made this point about how this has become very much, partisanship has become very much tied to group identity, even more than in the past when when identities were kind of cross-cutting, and you might be a white person, but you were a Catholic, and those tended to be Democrats, whereas Protestants tended to be, mainline Protestants tended to be more Republican. All of these identities like that have started to align. And so now we have these really such strong identities tied to partisanship, group identities, that you get this really interesting, I think this is exactly the answer to the first question you posed in this section, which is how do we appear to be moving apart, the parties moving apart, and still getting rewarded for that, even though the public, in terms of their issue preferences, still seems to be closer to the middle. I mean, take, for example, in 2017 in Alabama, where the Republican Party lost a pretty easy, what would have been a pretty easy Senate seat when they put up Roy Moore, I'm not going to get into the details about the allegations against Roy Moore, but they were deeply disturbing. And he was a deeply flawed candidate, according to the GOP itself, not just according to Democrats. And he lost by a very small margin in that election. And, you might think that losing an important election like that would teach the GOP a lesson, getting back to Michael, to Professor Jones-Correa's point, that you don't put up extreme candidates like that because you'll lose the general election. Well, Doug Jones lost in the next election, right? He lost the next time he was up. And so there is no long-term penalty associated with putting up extreme candidates. And that's why I think, and the reason for that is that in the general election, people vote their group identities, which happen to overlap almost completely with their partisan identities. And so that creates a real problem. The stickiness of these group identities creates a real problem for representativeness, because now people are voting for candidates who don't actually share their issue positions. And they're actually explicit about it, which, if you really want to get depressed, you'll notice that if candidates are explicit about not holding the issue preferences of their constituents, then education can't get us out of this problem, because you can tell people that Roy Moore does not share your preferences on a lot of important issues. And if it weren't for the fact that he was alleged to do all these horrible things with underage girls at the time when he was younger, he would have been elected immediately. He only lost by 1.5% to Doug Jones. So that's the part that's so frustrating, is that, and I know you want to get to this eventually, what's the role for universities? What's the role for higher education? What's the role for our public education system? Do we need to somehow educate people to be better citizens? Well, education can't fix some of these problems. It can fix some, but not all of these problems, because making people more aware of their issue positions compared to their elected officials will not stop them from voting for elected officials from their own party. The party connection is too strong. It's an in-group identity. And that's what's really scary, I think, to a lot of us.
I was just saying that despite my best efforts, we keep coming back to depressing conclusions on some of these issues. But let's, before I turn to some questions from the audience, let's get to the point you were just making at the end there, Nick, about what is the role of various institutions. One thing that actually, just to turn to one of the questions that was raised in the chat was, how much of this is because we're electing people who are not the best people to be representing us, not only based on issues, but even based on their extreme points of views? How much of this is do we lay in the laps of the public? And I hear, Nick, even though you didn't put it in these terms, there's something going on in the way people are making decisions that seems to, and again, I don't know how new this is. You all could talk about it better than I can. That suggests that people are voting in ways that are not only contrary to some notion of the public interest, but even contrary to their own interests, and maybe, and this is the open question, more than was the case before. I don't know if that's the case, but what I'd like to do is just go around really quickly and see. I'm going to ask you a hard question, hard as these questions have been. What gives you hope right now? Is there anything that you see about what's happened in the last year? Because obviously the issues we're dealing with go back centuries, but in the last year, we have had a moment where we've talked as a country about issues of race and racism more than at any point that I've been alive. And I was alive for a lot of the 1960 civil rights movement, and it was obviously highly visible. But as a national conversation, it felt to me like this is different right now. Is there anything about this moment we're in right now that gives you hope that some of the deep-seated issues that we've been talking about here might actually be able to be addressed through the political system, through, as one question asker said, the whole issue of where does reconciliation fit into this? Is there a process that could help address these kind of issues? But let me just go back to my question. What, if anything, and you can say nothing, but what, if anything, gives you hope right now? And I feel like whoever I ask first is going to be on the spot. So let me just, Michael, I'm going to do it to you again. Is there anything right now that you see that, even if it's fleeting, even if it is something that you then come back and say, but boy, that's going to be hard, but is there anything that gives you hope in what you're seeing in the world right now on this issue?
So I'm going to start on a kind of pessimistic note. But it's going to become more optimistic. So the pessimism is that I think we're in a period of where a lot of people feel threatened by the changes they see around them as the country shifts demographically. So there's a lot of racial threat, and this is felt in large part among an older generation of whites, but not only. There's been a lot of work done in social psychology and in political science where that shows that this kind of implicit bias, racial threat, underlies a lot of white voters' decisions in the ballot box, so that's the negative part. The positive part is that I think there is some differentiation across generations. So
that's good.
So one thing is that, say you're 65 in the United States, you came of age, say in the 1970s, maybe 60s, 70s, at a point when the United States was the least demographically diverse that it has ever been. So immigration was at its low point. Immigrants were maybe 7% of the U.S. population. African Americans were 10% of the U.S. population, and you grew up in a society where you could be convinced that whites had this unchallenged place in American society, and you were taught this in your schools, and it was reinforced in every dimension, media, in sort of everywhere. But this was a moment in time, and ever since that moment, the U.S. has been becoming steadily more diverse. And every generation that comes of age is coming of age in a more diverse society. So if you're 18 years old right now, you have grown up in a cohort that has no ethnic or racial majority, is the way that I like to put it. It is the most racially, ethnically diverse cohort that we have ever seen in the United States. And that cohort has a different perspective on race and ethnicity. I'm not going to say that it's all going to be hunky-dory and liberal and progressive. I'm just saying it's different. And that's reflected in something that was mentioned earlier about the diversity of the crowds that were marching in the George Floyd protests in the summer of 2020. They were younger and very diverse. And so that gives me hope. So this kind of generational transitioning gives me hope. I don't know where it will get us. I don't think it will make everything perfect, but it does give me some hope.
Thank you. Nick.
I too think that was a bright moment that I saw and young people, including young people in my own family, who wanted to risk getting, going to crowds in order to protest because they felt so passionately. I just finished a book on that gives me some hope, which is that there are a significant number of people, both from both parties, from all races and backgrounds, that have the ability to put themselves in the shoes of other people who are suffering. We refer to this as outgroup or intergroup empathy, and this is not just feeling bad for people who are suffering. It's actually an ability that you can transport yourself into the shoes of someone who's experiencing something very hard, and you can understand why they would behave the way they do once you get there. This is the notion of outgroup empathy that we've been studying. And what I'm interested in sharing just very briefly is that education is highly correlated with this ability to empathize with different groups, people other than your own group. And income is not correlated at all. And what that means, we think, is that it's one of these cases where income and education actually don't go together. And that's an important point, because whenever we say something's good about education, the concern is, oh, that's just rich people and their privilege, and that's why they turn out to have better outcomes. And it's not education. And especially in a university system, we're all at elite universities. Easy for us to say these kids are not getting any added value out of the educational system. They're just rich kids. I think in this case, learning with each other and building something together under conditions of at least relative equality. This is, building on the contact theory, contact hypothesis that has been around for a long time. But educational systems do have the ability to bring us together in more or less egalitarian circumstances where we can learn together and build something together and see the world through other people's perspectives. And I think that's, as kumbaya as it sounds, I think that's of significant value. And I think that's one reason why a lot of young people are more active, is that they actually are right up against these problems because their fellow students, as segregated as many schools are, and that's a problem, they are right up against these issues that other kids are going through in a way that, as we get older and completely remove ourselves from those diverse environments, we are less confronted with. So maybe that sounds too optimistic, but that's one of the reasons why I'm optimistic.
Oh, and it dovetails nicely with the point that Michael was making, I think, as well. Traci, anything that gives you hope right now?
I have to answer this question a lot, actually, because everything I work on is depressing. And so at the end, people are always, especially students are always like, well, what advice can you give activists? And what I usually say is this. When I started working on this stuff, now almost 20 years ago, I work on criminal justice, right? It just felt like screaming into the abyss. There was no hope for anything. And I've managed in my career to see a lot of change in a relatively short time. We're talking about things like bail reform and accomplishing things like prison populations are coming down. people are just, the whole ideology of tough on crime is a little different than it used to be. And I testified before the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights like a few years ago, and I was on a panel where people from Heritage were on my right, and people from the Cato Institute were on my left, and we all said the same thing. It's just been a very, I give talks to lawyers and judges who are interested in thinking about how to make the system better. So it just is, and you just see these signs of hope and change over time that you don't, if you forget about those and you miss those, you can easily become hopeless. But if something like, if you think about what mass incarceration was like and how influential it's been on public opinion, or even the idea that there was a big push to end or to reconsider legal debt and legal financial obligations. We've just seen so much change, positive change, I think, that it's been encouraging for me.
That's great. Thank you for pointing those examples out. Vince.
Yeah, I'll be brief. So I agree about the diversity of the protests and the widespread participation in the protests last summer. But I guess there's one other thing I'll just say quickly, and it's in answer to the question, what gives me some hope? Although I will frame it by saying that I am not unaware of the massive challenges that we continue to face in terms of confronting racial inequity. They are profound. Nevertheless, in response to the question, what gives me hope? I will say this: the current political moment, with all the gnashing of teeth and all the kind of consternation, in some respects gives me hope, because I am currently living through the most progressive, racially progressive Democratic presidency in my lifetime.
Yes.
Not Barack Obama, not Jimmy Carter, not Bill Clinton, not any of those other folks. The American Rescue Plan Act was, as I think Nancy Pelosi said, the most consequential piece of legislation she has ever been associated with. And Biden claims that he's just getting started. And so I've never had a president proclaim that he is going to make racial justice the center of every policy he puts forward. I'm like, wait a minute, what did he just say? Now, I don't want to break out the champagne yet. After 400 years, one gets a little cynical on these matters. But nevertheless, I've never had a politician, I've never heard a prominent politician say these things. Joe Biden has come out in favor of a commission to study reparations. Let's, again, not go crazy. He hasn't come out in favor of reparations, but he has gone further than any president I have ever seen on this matter. Indeed, arguably further than any president since Lyndon Johnson or maybe Abraham Lincoln. And I don't have any illusions that he will encounter considerable obstacles in Congress and in other sectors of our society. But if one can't draw some sense of hope by the boldness of the Biden administration, then maybe there's no hope to be found.
That's a great example, and it addresses some of what we started with, I think, which is, again, with all the caveats that you correctly mentioned, Vince, there does seem to be something about the way the Biden administration is approaching issues that is more integrative than you've seen in the past, not only on issues of race, but also on issues of the environment and climate change. So, that's a tough call. These things have to get passed and implemented, but I think that's a really good optimistic point with all the caveats that are correct that you mentioned. I want to ask, and we can do this quickly, just one kind of summary question from the audience that's based on a couple of the questions that we got. And it puts me to mind, again, as an old political scientist, the older theories of political science, which is, what are the possibilities for what we used to call a realignment in the parties, or at a minimum, the possibility of a third party emergence, given, we have that whole idea that parties could actually suddenly in an election or two shift gears, and the possibility of third parties, which have never been very successful in the United States. But I do want you, as political scientists, to address that question. Is that something that it could be in the works? A third party, at least temporarily third party, that combines some of the more moderate views of both other parties, or some other kind of realignment? One of the questions noted that there's a fair amount of diversity in the viewpoints of African Americans, and would we, in a way that almost feels ironic, be better off if more African Americans gravitated towards a Republican or a more moderate conservative party, even if it's not the Republicans, to kind of shake up some of the issues that you all raised today? So any quick thoughts on, is that, you see that in the cards at all, either realigning or the emergence of an effort for a third party that could have any chance of being successful at the national level? Anybody want to just give a quick set of thoughts on that? Yeah, Michael. No. And is it because of all the structural barriers that work against a third party in the United States?
In part, yes. And in part because of something that Nick mentioned earlier, which is that party identity has become a group identity. It's very difficult to think of people giving up their group identity. Yeah. I think I was surprised, perhaps naively surprised, that in 2016 there weren't more Republicans that broke away from the Republican Party to vote in opposition or for a third party candidate. That number was actually quite small. And it has to do, again, with the sense of partisan identity being group identity. But if there were ever a time when you might have expected voters to break away, it would have been then. We had a candidate who was not a typical candidate, who disagreed with core positions the party had held shortly before. But none of that occurred. I don't see a third party in the cards.
Yeah. Any other quick thoughts on that, or General C nodding of heads? I mean,
the structural forces, they're not that complicated, actually, just to lay them out for the audience, that most of which I'm sure know, but single member district rules, which single member district rules lead to two-party systems very regularly. It's one of the only things we like to tell our students. It's one of the only laws of political science, is that if you have voting rules that say the majority vote or the plurality vote wins, you're going to get two parties. And if you want more than two parties, you're going to have proportional representation, multiple member districts. And we don't have that in the US system, almost non-existent in our system. So that has to be changed at the constitutional level, and then in many state level rules as well. So just another more detailed to associate myself with Michael's answer, which is that it's not going to happen.
Yeah, I appreciate you clarifying that, because that did get a little bit, again, inside baseball. I mean, I will say one thing, which I think should give us a little bit of pause about our certainty about some of these things, including certainty about, not certainty, but the affective nature of partisanship, is that, at least the last time I checked, the number of people who identified with the Republican Party and or who leaned towards the Republican Party if they call themselves independent is at a recent low point. So something's happening that that suggests that identity, as clearly important as it is with the as a Republican, this is something you can still shed your identity of, and there's at least a little bit of that going on right now. Not that leads to the creation of a third party or a change in what the Republicans do, for sure. So anyways, I'm cognizant of the time, and I apologize to attendees whose questions we were unable to get to. But before we end, I want to encourage our audience members to attend our next and, in fact, last panel of the year, where we'll be discussing issues of the ongoing struggle for racial justice and the role of social activism and social movements. That panel will be a week from today, Wednesday, April 28th, from 5 to 6:15 again. Information on registering for the panel will be distributed starting tomorrow. We have another great group of panelists, so please spread the word and consider attending. And with that, I'd like to thank our panelists who were here today for what I consider to be a really great, thoughtful discussion, our audience for attending, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your evening, and hope to see you all, or many of you, at our last panel. So on my behalf and on behalf of the audience, Vince and Michael and Nick and Traci, thank you very much for bringing your insights to today's panel. It's very much appreciated.